The sky was turning that in-between color, not quite night, not quite day. I was standing on my porch, the air sharp with the smell of wood smoke, holding my old mailbox in one hand. Inside was a folded note, written in tidy blue ink: "We sold the house, you can pick up the last keys." I blinked at it once, then again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something else. The house, my house, the one Thomas and I built board by board, year by year. For a moment, the world felt tilted, the porch, the sky, even the sound of the cicadas seemed off. I thought my husband had left this home to the community, a small trust in his name, something steady, like him. But this note, it told another story. Asterisk, the mailbox felt heavier in my hand, and the air around me colder. Have you ever trusted a life to someone, only to find the keys in another person's hand? When I went to the deed office the next morning, I saw a name I'd never expected on the papers. Asterisk, now listen. This isn't a story about bitterness, it's a story about finding out what promises really mean, and who keeps them when you're gone. See, this isn't gossip, it's a lesson. One I learned the long way, through paperwork, porch lights, and one woman I thought was my friend. If you've ever had your place rewritten without your say-so, if you've ever been told, "Don't worry, it's all taken care of," this story is for you. Go on, like and subscribe if you've ever had to fight to be heard in your own family, your own town, your own home. I promise you, I'll tell it straight, the good, the bad, and the beautiful parts that came after. Asterisk, so sit with me a while, pour some tea, and let me tell you how a house, a promise, and one unlikely woman changed everything. Asterisk, the mornings here have a rhythm like an old hymn, steady, simple, and enough to keep a widow company. I wake before dawn, fold the quilt back from the bed the way Thomas liked, and let the light find the brass on the dresser. The kettle is first. Its small whistle fills the kitchen and tells me the day can begin. I make my tea with the same careful motions I learned when our children were small, stirring clockwise because my mother said it chased the lumps out of worry. After breakfast I walk the garden. The roses Thomas planted 20 years ago lean toward the sun, like polite neighbors. I clip a faded bud, tuck it in a jar, and set it by the window where the light makes it look new again. I check the mail. It is a ritual, a small reassurance that paper still connects us. There are always postcards, the church bulletin, a flyer about the bake sale. Sometimes a neighbor slips a note through the slot about a lost cat or a casserole for someone sick. Those are the small tokens of a place that remembers people. On this morning, the slot gave me an envelope thicker than usual, cream paper with a typed return. The flap had been sealed carefully, and my name, Evelyn Hart, was printed in a hand that could have been a clerk's or a niece's. I set the envelope on the table and made the tea. Making the tea was a way to give myself time. Sometimes the world tilts when you don't expect it, and the kettle keeps time for you. I slid my finger under the seal and unfolded the letter. It said plainly that the house had been sold and the keys were ready for me to pick up. I read it twice. The words sat like a stone in my hands. For a moment I thought it a mistake. Perhaps someone had meant to ask me to sign a paper. Perhaps the town had decided to buy the house from the estate to turn it into something useful. But beneath the polite language the note suggested a choice had already been made. My hands remembered the way Thomas used to hold the mailbox. They knew the groove. The small chip on the right side where he hit it once with a hammer and swore he'd get it fixed tomorrow. Memory is a physical thing. It lives in calluses, and the way your fingers rest on familiar wood. The envelope felt heavier because it was a small piece of a larger story set down without me. The porch light hummed softly as I walked outside to look at the house from the road. It was the same roof, the same steps, the same ivy on the trellis. But a line had been drawn across the property in ink somewhere I could not see. I opened the drawer where Thomas kept keys for everything: gutters, the shed, the old chest in the attic, and found the slot where one key always lived. It was empty. I drove to the deed office because that is what you do when a private thing becomes official. The clerk looked up with a practiced smile and slid a folder across the counter. On the top page, in neat script, was a name I did not recognize, the name of a woman who had lived down the street for as long as I could remember. A woman who baked bread and ran senior bingo nights. The deed showed a transfer dated months before Thomas died. I stood there, folder in hand, feeling very small and very old. The house was the sum of our years together, the place where we learned how to be a family. Now its ownership had been rearranged, and the pages of the deed moved like a breeze through curtains. showing me a version of the house I'd never been asked to see. The small comforts the house kept, the kettle, the quilts, the porch light, had not changed, but the story they held had, and I was left with the single hard need to understand why. I walked through the rooms that afternoon, touching the surfaces as if to read the years. The living room still smelled of lemon oil, and the faint curl of pipe smoke from colder months. I opened drawers and found old receipts, a ticket stub, and a child's drawing tucked behind a postcard. Each little thing was a stitch of our life together. Neighbors came by with casseroles and smiles. They spoke in gentle voices and said, "If you need anything, Evie," as if that could mend an absence made official on paper. I sat by the window as rain began and watched the house reflect back at me with wet panes like a portrait I barely recognized. That evening I made a list, calls to place, papers to find, names to ask, and pinned it to the fridge. I would not let the house become a rumor on porches. I set the envelope beside the kettle and sat until the light went out, counting the small things belonging to us. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. I grew up in a house where neighbors were more like kin than acquaintances. My father worked at the mill, and my mother mended clothes for people down the block. Money was scarce, but the table was never empty because someone always brought a casserole or an extra loaf of bread. Promises were kept with actions more than with words. A hand at the wheel, a roof mended before rain, a casserole left on a stoop. Those early lessons stayed with me, that care is work, and work is love made visible. I met Thomas at a church supper. He came with a shy smile and a pocket knife. He used to whittle small wooden toys for the neighborhood children. He had steady hands and the kind of patience that could make a broken fence look like something to be repaired, not replaced. We married and began building a life in small increments, a garden in the side yard, a tool shed, a roof fixed after a storm. Thomas believed in showing up. He said, "We don't leave people behind. We leave the porch light on." Those words became a rule for us. When someone needed help, we went. When someone was ill, we cooked. When a new neighbor arrived, we found a chair and set it at our table. Over the years, we raised children who learned the same quiet manners. We taught them to answer a letter, to return a borrowed cup, to say thank you. Our house became a place where people came for advice and a slice of pie, where the church bulletin was pinned to the board and the calendar kept us all in order. But that steady life depends on small truisms. Honesty in the ledgers, mutual respect, and the assumption that decisions that affect two lives are not made alone. Thomas and I kept the books together for a long time. He handled the heavy tasks, the shingles, the trucks, the contracts. I balanced the receipts and wrote the checks. Those days taught me that a promise is less about a single, grand declaration and more about the hundreds of small things that add up. I never thought that the habits of showing up could be undone by a page and a signature. Thomas taught me another quiet practice, listening before deciding. He would sit on the back steps with his coffee and listen to the town. People told him worries about schools, about bills, about a boy who needed shoes. He took those small complaints into his hands and worked on them, sometimes giving his time, sometimes his labor. When we argued, and we did, like any pair of people who share a life, his answer was never a loud correction. He would fix the problem the next day. A loose stair, a leaking pipe, a promise made right. That steadiness made him beloved in the neighborhood. People trusted him more than they trusted bureaucrats, because his work had a face and a name. He was a man who returned a borrowed still-warm pie plate, who would swing by with an extra jar of jam when spring brought a neighbor's first grandchild. I look back now and see how much of a life is built on the accumulation of those small courtesies. They are not insignificant. They are the mortar between bricks. It is why the house meant more than walls to me. It was a ledger of quiet duties, and, for the most part, those duties were reciprocal. We gave and received in ways that made sense for our life. But life is not a perfect ledger. There are footnotes and amendments you only notice when the accounts are opened. I remember the day Thomas started spending longer at the desk. Business calls that used to be brief stretched late into nights. He would say little, only that work required attention. He began to visit the post office in the evenings and sometimes drove to the next town. I asked once, and he waved it away with a small smile and "It's nothing you need to worry about." Those small omissions may seem harmless at the time. You assume trust will carry you through. You do not expect the omissions to line up with paper later. Still, there were moments of tenderness, the time he surprised me with a new rocking chair on our 20th anniversary, the afternoons we spent teaching the children to carve wooden spoons, the nights we stayed up listening to the radio and planning little improvements, those memories anchor me. They are evidence that love existed, in both the ordinary and the exceptional. I did not expect those anchors to be tested by a signature on a deed or a transfer penned without a conversation, but they were, and when the day came to read those papers, every small kindness and every small omission came into a single bright light today. Our life together was ordinary in the best way. We ran the small woodworking shop out back where Thomas rebuilt chairs and patched shutters. Neighbors brought him bits of wood and he made toys for the town fair. I ran the bake sales and taught quilting at the church. We hosted block parties and holiday dinners where someone always arrived with a casserole and kids left sticky with pie. Those routines tie a town together. You can predict the rhythm of a place by who shows up for what and how often. But even predictable lives collect small, quiet fissures. He began to get those looks in his eyes, the kind that suggests someone is keeping an account in a ledger only they can read. A missed call turned into another missed call. A favor promised to one neighbor was given to another without mention. A private meeting in the evening would become a weekend trip he thanked me for later. At first I chalked it up to business. The world is full of errands and obligations. You forgive absences because you have faith the person will return and explain. Gradually, those absences formed a pattern. They felt like an unspoken column on the page. A second accounting I hadn't been invited to see. In a marriage, you assume certain things will be shared. Secrets are expensive. They cost trust. I found myself noticing receipts in pockets, postmarks on envelopes, small bank notices that suggested activity I had not been told about. It felt like learning a language I had not been taught, yet the work of the house continued. I mended shirts and made lists and answered the doorbell. The children grew and left rooms that still smelled faintly of their laughter. It is easy to live with gentle uncertainty when your days are full. But the quiet becomes a problem when it becomes the only sound. Then the deed appeared, and the ledger was not just a metaphor anymore. Paper made the difference concrete. I felt an indignation, not about money, but about voice, about being sidelined in decisions that had defined our life. The question that followed was not only legal, it was existential. Who guardians our memories when the people who made them are gone? I used to think the answer was simple. The family, the town, the people who shared the porch, but the paper showed me complexity. It showed me that kindness can come wrapped in control. It taught me how fragile stewardship can be when contracts meet affection. I started to ask questions. I spoke to the neighbor who mowed our lawn. I asked the woman who ran senior bingo if she'd noticed Thomas acting different. Answers came in fragments. He had mentioned ensuring the house would be used for the town. He'd been seen at the diner talking for a long time with Mrs. Lyle. Those pieces were not damning on their own, but together they suggested decisions were happening in rooms where my name had not been spoken. The realization cut deeper than I expected. Some nights I allowed myself hopeful explanations, a plan to reduce taxes, a private gift to a cause, a wish to avoid family strife. I wanted those reasons. I wanted to honor what he'd done, but wanting is not the same as knowing. I needed dates, documents, and names, facts that turn rumor into history. So I made a list and began to gather records. It felt odd to hunt paperwork for his memory, yet being methodical was its own act of care. To know is to respect the truth of a life. When I read the transfer at the deed office and saw the signature that belonged to him, I felt a stable thing shift. It didn't erase the good afternoons carving spoons or the Sundays we kept the porch light on. It only made me see that stewardship has an outward face, signed papers and public decisions, as well as an inward one. I kept looking still. The deed office is one of those quiet rooms where time seems to move by forms and stamps. The clerk wore that kind of patient face people in small towns wear when they deal with other people's private things. He slid a folder across, and I unfolded the paper slow enough to feel each word like a small weight. There it was, the transfer, the legal language that makes decisions final, and a neat script in the signature line. Not my name. Her name, Mrs. Lyles. I knew her baked bread for the church socials. Ran bingo at the senior center. Always ready with a casserole. I remember thinking, she's always helped. Perhaps she'd help now. But the date on the deed stopped me cold. Months before the funeral. Months before, people were paying attention. The transfer cited community stewardship and some clause about maintaining the property for public benefit. He wanted it safe, the clerk offered. as if the paper might soften the blow. I left with the folder clutched to my chest like a Bible. On the drive home, the town passed in small pieces. I'd lived a lifetime inside. The hardware store where Thomas bought screws. The diner where he ate the day after the workshop burnt out. Every corner felt familiar, and suddenly, slightly alien. That night I sat on the back steps and held the deed in the dark. I thought of the years we'd spent on this roof. I thought of the way he'd tighten his jaw and promise me, "We'll handle it." I began to wonder which we he meant. The next day I walked to Mrs. Lyle's house with the deed folded in my purse. She opened the door like a woman who hated fuss. Her smile was warm and the kind of neighborly that made you feel seen. "Oh, Evie," she said, "we thought it best. Thomas was worried about upkeep, about taxes. We don't want this house to fall into disrepair." Her voice had that steady comfort my town uses to smooth sharp edges. I asked gently, "Did he tell you?" Her hand smoothed a tea towel. "He told me enough." That phrase, enough, became a thin cord that stretched between us. We each held one end. It was not an answer. It was permission. I left her house with my chest tight. I remember the peculiar way the street looked as I walked back. Ordinary, lined with mailboxes and hydrangeas, but now underlaid by the knowledge that a decision had been taken in rooms I had not been invited into. That knowledge did something to the shape of our life. It turned habitual acts into questions. It made the mailbox feel like evidence. I thought then that I would not let this pass without asking why. When I confronted Mrs. Lyle, she smiled too kindly and said, "We thought you'd want the town to keep it safe." I began to call the people who must know small things. The niece who used to take Thomas fishing, the man who fixed our fence, the neighbor who always borrowed sugar. Answers arrived like pieces of a broken plate, small, sharp, and not quite enough to form a picture. "We heard he was worried about taxes," my niece said, voice guarded. "He mentioned a plan," offered Mrs. Clifton, who runs the PTA at the diner. A woman I'd known since grade school leaned in and lowered her voice. "Saw him out on County Road late one night," she confided, talking to Mrs. Lyle. Each piece whispered of decisions made in corners, of conversations that happened with doors closed. People tried to be kind. "It will be used for good," they said, as if repeating it might make it true. But kindness and truth are not the same thing. In the quiet of my kitchen, I spread papers on the table. The DIT, a photocopy of a canceled check, a note in Thomas's handwriting I'd found tucked in a drawer. The handwriting bent in familiar loops. The note simply read, "I'll make sure the house is cared for." No dates. No details. It is strange how much a person can mean to you and yet leave pieces of themselves in places you don't see until you begin to look. I went to the workshop and opened drawers he used to keep parts in. I always pictured him there, bent over a project, humming under his breath. That day I found a receipt for a small trust office in the next county, an address I did not recognize, and a stamp from months ago. A chill went through me. It felt like someone had been writing a second will, quietly, in the spaces between ordinary days. I did not know yet whether it was a kindness disguised or a plan that hid other motives. All I knew was that my name had not been asked to the meeting where our home was being arranged. A decision had been made and I had not been told. That absence is the loudest sound in small-town life. People notice it. They shift. Invitations stop. Conversations become careful. I felt my role in the town change from participant to questioner, and nobody in a place that values quiet was used to the noise I was making by asking for answers. So I started looking for the rest of the story. Because silence in a town is louder than any argument. The trust office sits just off the square in the next town over. It looks unassuming from the street, a green door, a brass bell, a modest plaque that says Stewardship Board. The young woman behind the desk had a polite smile and a stack of papers like a stack of polite excuses. I asked for records. She brought a folder, thick with forms, the kind of neatness that suggests organization and authority. There it was, a deed transfer, a stewardship agreement, witness signatures, and Mrs. Lyle's printed name as chair. The dates lined up with the deed I'd seen at the clerk's office. There were also initials I didn't recognize. Next to an approval line, someone else had been involved. The board's minutes referenced an arrangement. The house would become a community resource if certain conditions were met. That language sounds reasonable in a meeting room. It sounds good on a plaque, but the small print always matters. A final page mentioned an emergency clause, that the chair had authority to act if the estate's maintenance fell into jeopardy. An emergency clause can be an act of foresight or a blank check depending on who writes it. I asked where the funds for upkeep would come from. The secretary slid across a bank slip with a withdrawal labeled "Maintenance Transfer." One column listed the account and the date conspicuously. Shortly after the thing everyone knew was happening. Thomas's absence. It was a move that, on paper, protected the property. But why did the transfer happen so soon, and under whose precise authority? I felt as if reasons were politely stacked like folded napkins and set on a table the town was expected to accept as catering. I asked the secretary whether there had been consultation with family. She adjusted her glasses and said, "We informed the next of kin via certified mail." Her voice was even, practiced. She produced a copy of a letter, a stamped receipt. The letter was brief, phrased with careful gentleness. "Mr. Hart asked us to oversee the property for the community's benefit. The problem was the timing and the lack of detailed conversation with me. It felt like a kindness offered as fait accompli." I pressed, "Who authorized the emergency clause?" She hesitated and named a lawyer I knew in passing. Names in paper can seem like security until you remember names are people. When I asked about the signature initials, she said she couldn't share more without permission from the board. Paperwork can sound kind until you read between the lines. Then she slid a photograph quietly across the folder. A banquet photo where Thomas stood beside Mrs. Lyle, their shoulders close, smiles practiced for a camera. The image made my chest tighten. It was not malicious. It was a picture of two people making choices with other people's futures in the balance. The banquet photo sat in my hands like a portrait of a life I both recognized and didn't. There they were. Thomas with his arm around Mrs. Lyle, smiling in the kind of way people smile when a camera signals them to look like the best version of themselves. Behind them, a plaque listed sponsors, and a project name, Heart Community Outreach. The photo could have been the image of a man proud of the work he'd done. It also could be the image of two people deciding on a future in which I had no say. Word moves fast in small towns. Within days, neighbors at the post office lowered their voices as I approached. At the church, people asked if I was coping and whether I would be okay with the house becoming a public space. Trustees met in the library and released a statement about the house being opened for community programs. They spoke with an air of public service, words about enrichment, about libraries, about community rooms for senior activities. The idea itself was not offensive. I saw the good in parts of it. A community room could host book clubs, bake sales, and children's story hours, but beneath that public benefit there was a private reality. The room that had once been our parlor would be rearranged, its mantel a display case rather than a place for the photographs of our children. I felt torn in two directions: honor the man for what he did for his town, and protect the place where we had raised a family. The trustees said Thomas had wanted the house to serve many. They had the paperwork to support it, and a generous number of signatures. I began to attend meetings, walking into rooms that had once been so familiar I'd known every creak. I listened while plans were laid out in careful phrases. People offered compromise after compromise, as if compromise alone could heal the absence of my voice. In the margins of a plan, someone scribbled the phrase, "Evelyn's room," with a small star. It felt like a half-hearted apology. One evening, late, I went to Thomas's desk and found a sticky note tucked beneath a drawer liner. In his hand, neat and small, was a single line: "Don't tell Evie yet." The note looked ordinary until you realized how much ordinary could weigh. A private arrangement, a promise to someone, a reason I hadn't been entrusted with. Sometimes kindness is a mask for decisions that leave hearts empty. The sticky note made my chest hollow in a way a printed deed never had. The date was set in ink on a notice, posted to the library bulletin board. 2 weeks until the council meeting to approve temporary possession for the stewardship board. 2 weeks is not a long time when the thing at stake is a life's worth of memory under a roof. Suddenly the town had timetables and petitions. Volunteers approached me at the farmers market with pleading eyes. "We need spaces, Evie," they said. "Children's programs, classes." Their voices carried an urgency that sounded like progress. I would have understood if the decision had been made with me at the table. I would have understood if Thomas had said, "I planned this, and Evie knows." But it was different. This beat felt like a pressure that would split the town. I hired a lawyer that week, a quiet woman who took notes with a thin pen and made me feel as if she had a plan that would not make my name into a spectacle. She explained the timelines and the probate rules, the petitions, the options for injunction, and the costs. Legal things always sound cleaner on paper than they feel in the gut. Friends offered opinions. Some said I should fight it all the way to court. Others urged me to reach a settlement, a caretaker's role, perhaps, or at least a room preserved. I did not want to make enemies where there had been neighbors, but I also did not want to watch the house become a public facility without the acknowledgement of what it had been. The trustees pushed forward, citing community needs and the benefit of immediate access. The bank representative talked about fiscal responsibility and liability, and how temporary possession reduced exposure. The calendar days fell away, and with each dawn I felt options slipping quietly into decisions I had not yet articulated. The town's kindness sometimes sounded like a demand, and the kindness felt urgent. When I stood at the tribunal 2 weeks later, I had papers and receipts, and Thomas's own handwriting. I had neighbors who supported me, and neighbors who did not. The meeting began with polite introductions. The trustees presented their vision. I had a speech written in my head, and my lawyer had a plan. Mrs. Lyle brought a folded letter Thomas had written months before, and when she handed it to the council, the room watched my hands, waiting to see which would move first. Deadlines forced choices into the open like noonlight on old wood. I hired a lawyer and went to the meeting, and Mrs. Lyle produced a letter Thomas had written months before. The letter Thomas left was thin at the creases, the kind of paper you keep because it belonged to someone you once shared tea with. I unfolded it at the kitchen table and read the neat script until the words felt like small footsteps across the table. Thomas spoke about seeding a project, a modest thing, he wrote, to help veterans and to offer a shelter for town learning. He said he wanted the house kept in hands that would care for everyone, that sounded like him, steady, practical, wanting good to last. Then, in a single line that almost looked like an aside, he mentioned help he'd taken in a quiet hour, a loan offered by a neighbor to help with an overdue tax bill, a temporary bridge to keep the house afloat. He asked that the neighbor's involvement be kept confidential, to protect reputations, he wrote. At first I wanted to be angry, then I wanted to understand. The sentence bent the room around me. The deed became less a rejection and more a patchwork of motives, public goods stitched to private relief. I began to read earlier papers with fresh eyes. Receipts that once looked like nothing took on meaning. A cancelled check I'd glanced past in his work jacket matched dates in the ledger the niece later handed me. It was a little like seeing a map where before there had only been blank paper. The private loan explained how the transfer could happen if someone had underwritten taxes or promised maintenance. An emergency clause in a stewardship agreement could be legally triggered. The moral question arrived. If sheltering the property for the town meant excluding a spouse's voice, was that protection or erasure? I kept turning the letter. Thomas's tone was respectful of both worlds, the public good he admired, and the small private life he preferred to shield. He wrote with the weary kindness of a man who fixes things quietly. He wrote that he feared being a burden. He wrote that asking for help felt like admitting failure. That line kept me up nights. It explained why he might have accepted assistance without full conversation. But it did not excuse the omission. So the midpoint did not give me a simple villain. It gave me complexity. Thomas had wanted usefulness. He had wanted permanence for causes he cared about. He had also wanted to protect me from worry, even if protection meant hiding details. The letter made my fight clearer. It was no longer only about reversing a transfer or reclaiming a title. It was about honoring intention and ensuring accountability. It was about making sure politeness and secrecy do not become tools that erase the people who shared a life. I went to the bank with the letter in my bag. The clerk, polite and precise, found a file. Hidden in the bank's pages was the record of a loan. But it was arranged under the name of a small trust and showed an agent I did not recognize. It was one more line in the map. Each new sheet I uncovered altered the picture. Thomas had tried to steward a cause and to shelter a family, and the two aims had tangled. Sometimes the smallest lines in a letter rearranged the whole room. When I requested the loan documents, the bank brought me a file with a name I didn't expect. The more I asked, the more the town seemed to draw back, as if I had rattled a cobwebbed window. Invitations stopped. The quilting ladies began meeting without me. Neighbors who once brought pie now crossed to the other side of the street. Someone slid an anonymous note under my door one morning that read, "Some things are better left as gifts." The handwriting was neat. The tone was final. My phone filled with cautious messages. A cousin called and asked me to consider the town's peace. A friend texted, "It's not worth making enemies, Evie." Their warnings were gentle, but they all leaned the same direction. I knew their worry came from experience. Small towns mend by softening edges, but softening can also hide truths that deserve daylight. At the same time, a tax notice arrived among the day's mail, showing deferred payments Thomas had arranged. Deferred payments aren't scandal by themselves, but they help explain why he might have accepted help in private. That fact made him more human to me, and it made the work ahead more necessary. If he had accepted help to preserve a home for the town, then the terms and timing mattered in a practical way, not just a sentimental one. So I kept at it. I filed formal requests for documents and kept a ledger of calls. I wrote down every name and date. The labor was methodical and tedious, which suited me. People thought the truth would come instantly, but it came in small pieces: bank stamps, initials, a witness who remembered a late-night conversation. Each piece cost me something socially. I lost easy companionship and was quietly judged in church pews. Loneliness is not dramatic. It's the empty chair at sewing night, the sudden quiet when you step into a kitchen. Still, I decided the cost was worth paying. Truth, once found, steadies more than rumor ever could. If the house was to be a community gift, I wanted the gift made with integrity, not secrecy. If Thomas had been protecting me, as he often tried to, I wanted to understand it in order to honor it properly. The quiet courage it took felt small and stubborn. Collect facts, keep records, insist on transparency. The town hummed on, and I accepted distance so a clearer future might be built. And then, at dawn, a tax notice arrived that suggested Thomas had been carrying a heavier burden than he told me. Pressure arrived in neat envelopes and polite phone calls. Trustees asked I consider mediation. The town council suggested a public vote might be the fairest path. My lawyer told me to keep careful records and to expect both support and criticism. Mr. Daniels, the retired judge, sat me down with a cup of coffee and said, "Paper will be your friend, Evie. Get everything in writing and let the process do its work." His calm voice steadied me. The public hearing was held in the community hall under bright lights. People came in clusters, some with clipboards and statements of support, others curious, and a few who watched me as if I had rearranged their memory of the town. I placed the letter, the receipts, and the ledger on the table and spoke plainly. I read Thomas's note in the room where neighbors had once danced at holiday parties. I asked hard questions. Who authorized the emergency clause? Who signed after his death? And why wasn't his wife part of decisions about the house? The trustees spoke of service and preservation. They showed plans for a children's reading nook and an events calendar. Those plans had merit. Thomas had been generous, but generosity cannot replace conversation. People nodded when I said that. Some looked uncomfortable when I pointed to dates that suggested transfers and adjustments after his passing. The council announced an independent audit to trace funds and confirm authority. That felt like a step toward clarity rather than private assumptions. As the hearing closed, an old neighbor pressed a photograph into my hand. It was Thomas, with veterans, at a ribbon cutting, smiling in a way I recognized. On the back someone had written, "He meant to help." The image complicated what I felt. Love and pride sat beside the fact that I had been excluded. Heat from all sides meant legal pressure and emotional undercurrents, calls of support, whispers of criticism, and the quiet ache of friends who no longer sat as nearby at the quilting table. The board's call for an audit created a path forward. I filed the request and waited. The work was not sensational. It was patient, steady, yet, in that patience, I held a firm belief: you cannot change the past, but you can insist it be told honestly. The hearing ended with a motion to pilot the house as a community space, and an old neighbor slid a photograph into my hand. The nights lengthened with paperwork and worry. I sat under the lamp, the stove clock ticking, and my hands turned pages until the letters merged. There is a peculiar loneliness in holding the story of a life and asking others to share it. Sometimes I thought I was being stubborn. Other times I told myself I was doing what Thomas would have done: steady work to keep a promise. Sleep became a visitor I could not invite. I replayed small scenes in the dark: Thomas laughing with the children at the block party, the smell of wood shavings in the shop, the quiet of a winter morning when we'd sip coffee and make lists. Those memories were anchors, and they reminded me why the house mattered. But the social distance widened. An acquaintance who had once dropped by with rhubarb pie avoided the porch. The quilting circle folded their schedule without asking if I would prefer to stay on. Those minor losses add up. One night, when I nearly tucked the papers back into the drawer and let the matters sit, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from a veteran I did not know. His voice was rough, steady. He said, "Mrs. Hart, your husband helped me when I was in a bad patch. He paid my first month at the shelter and said, 'Don't tell her, she worries.' I wanted to say thank you." The message made me cry in a way that was not bitter, it was gratefulness. Thomas had tried to shield me, and the lives he touched were real and grateful. That gratitude steadied me. If his quiet help mattered to people, then the truth of how it was arranged mattered too. I decided not to burn bridges. I would seek clarity, but not vengeance. In the pale dawn, a text arrived. "Meet me at the old oak. I can help." I went, almost on habit, expecting nothing. Under the tree waited someone wrapped in a coat who said she was Mrs. Lyle's niece and handed me a small box of papers she could not keep to herself. The receipts and penciled notes in that box did not answer everything, but they provided a path forward. There was an accounting of a loan and notes showing certain repayments and adjustments that now made sense in a different light. Having that context changed my strategy. Instead of immediately demanding courtroom drama, I would aim for mediation that could honor Thomas's intent while protecting our family's place in the house. For one long night, I had wondered if I was being selfish or dutiful. The answer came gradually. This was duty shaped by compassion. I would press for truth, but do so with humility, aiming for repair rather than ruin. Under the old oak, the niece looked at me with tired eyes and set the box between us. The papers inside were quieter than I expected. A ledger with entries, receipts, and penciled notes that showed a loan and repayments, and small adjustments made after Thomas's passing. The entries explained why an emergency clause had been triggered and why Mrs. Lyle had acted when she did. Those facts didn't make the choice easy. They made it necessary. I called my lawyer, and we agreed to try mediation before heading into court. Litigation would mean months of public scrutiny and costs I did not relish. Mediation offered a way to craft the solution that honored Thomas's public-minded wishes while protecting the family's place in the house. At the table, we proposed a plan. The house remain available for community programs under a stewardship agreement, but an interior room be reserved as a family suite holding photographs and mementos, and a caretaker position be created with priority for a Hart family member. Mrs. Lyle explained her fear about taxes and upkeep. She admitted she had acted hurriedly. The niece corroborated my story. We negotiated calmly and with practical detail. An initial maintenance fund, a neutral trustee to oversee spending, scheduled family access for memorials, and a small plaque in the parlor recounting Thomas's aims. The mediator wrote each term down and each side initialed the pages. The act of writing felt like a promise made public. In the end, the agreement preserved the house's new role and protected our history. I accepted the caretaker's key with a sense of relief and a small sorrow. The key was simple: open the door, keep the kettle on for visitors, and make sure our photographs and Thomas's tools stay where they belong. It was a stewardship role more than power, and that suited me fine. She handed me proof when I thought none existed, and that changed the terms. But as we signed the papers and stepped out into the light, someone in the back of the hall stood and asked to speak. The town hall filled before sunrise, the smell of coffee mixed with rain coming off coats, and every seat was taken. These were the same faces that had smiled at me over bake sales, that had watched my children grow up. I sat in the front row with my lawyer beside me, my papers neat and trembling slightly at the edges. The trustees sat opposite Mrs. Lyle, the council president, the bank representative, and a young woman from the stewardship board. Between us, the mediator cleared his throat and called for calm. He began by reading the facts. One by one, he listed the transfers, the signatures, the loan agreement, the repayment schedule. Each name landed like a small stone in water. Then came the testimonies. I spoke first about the letter Thomas left, about our life, about the meaning of the word home when it isn't just walls. I said I wanted transparency, not triumph. I said I believed Thomas's generosity was real, but that the way it was handled had left wounds that paperwork could not heal alone. Then Mrs. Lyle took the floor. Her voice was softer than I expected. She said she had acted out of fear the house would fall into debt, fear that the taxes would swallow what Thomas had worked for. I thought I was preserving what he wanted, she said. I never meant to take it from you. Her words didn't absolve her, but they came from the human place where mistakes live, the kind that come from trying to do good in a hurry. The niece stood next, her voice trembling as she read from the ledger she had found. Records of repayment, notes in Thomas's handwriting acknowledging the debt, and one last entry that said, "Final payment complete. Thank her quietly." The room softened. Even the banker lowered his pen. The mediator took a long breath, looked between us, and said, "There's a path forward if both sides can honor what the other built." He proposed a compromise. The house would belong to the community trust, as Thomas intended, but a portion, a single suite inside, would be reserved permanently as a family space. It would hold photographs, Thomas's woodworking tools, and the old quilts that had covered our children. It would be called the Evelyn Suite. I would stay on as caretaker and historian, guiding programs, preserving stories, ensuring the home remained both a public space and a private remembrance. The town council deliberated quietly, the hum of conversation thick as rain. When the vote came, it was 5-4 in favor. The mediator nodded. Papers were passed, signatures made, hands shaken. Justice here is often negotiation, and sometimes dignity looks like compromise. I wasn't triumphant. I was steady. I felt Thomas in that steadiness, somewhere between pride and peace. When the vote passed, the hall erupted in murmurs, and my granddaughter ran up and hugged my leg. Peace, when it came, didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, in the familiar click of the kettle, in the way sunlight slipped across the floor again. The Evelyn Suite was finished by midsummer. The town painted the walls, soft cream, and placed Thomas's tools on floating shelves behind glass. A plaque near the window read, "In honor of Thomas and Evelyn Hart, for work, care, and the light they left on dot." I tended the herb garden just outside the kitchen. Lavender and thyme grew there, their scents carried through open windows into community meetings and story nights. On Tuesdays, children filled the main hall with noise, stacking picture books, and laughing in bursts that shook the old wood floors. On Fridays, the quilting circle returned. They apologized softly for their distance and helped me hang a new patchwork that included a square embroidered with the house's date. Neighbors began to say the place felt alive again. They used the rooms for council meetings, for veterans gatherings, for reading clubs, and school visits. I found joy in small caretaking acts, arranging chairs, setting out tea, greeting newcomers who'd only known this house as a community room and not as the home it had once been. Some evenings, after everyone left, I'd sit in the Evelyn Suite with the lights dimmed and trace the grain of the table Thomas built. I'd whisper a little prayer of thanks that the place still breathed both past and present. The small certainties had returned. The kettle's whistle, the smell of wood polish, the laughter of children, but softer now, wiser. And then, one morning as I cleaned out an old toolbox for display, my granddaughter called out, "Grandma, what's this?" Inside was a folded note in Thomas's handwriting. My hands went cool before I even opened it. The note was short, almost like an afterthought. It said, "Evie, if this reaches you, it means I trusted the right hands. Don't be angry. I just wanted to keep the porch light on for everyone." I read it aloud once and then tucked it inside the family Bible. It struck me then how often we confused love with possession. Thomas hadn't meant to erase me. He'd meant to protect something we built together. His mistake was silence, not malice. And my lesson was this: don't let silence hold your story. If you love someone, tell them where the papers are, what the plan is, what the dream is for after you're gone. It's not morbid, it's merciful. If you've got a house, a keepsake, even a recipe book that means something, write a note, label the box, make it easy for kindness to find its way through time. I tell people now that clarity is a kind of love, transparency is tenderness. When you put things in order, you make life lighter for those who come next. We all think legacy is marble or money, but it's not. It's stories that still make sense after we're gone. The house now stands as proof that stewardship and memory can share a roof. Its rooms hold meetings, but its heart still holds us. Don't leave your story to chance. Stitch it with clear words and kind intention. And maybe, the keys we hand over are not always loss, but invitations to keep loving in new ways. After the episode aired, the comments surprised me. They came like small letters on a digital porch. One said, "I called my mother today and asked where her papers are." Another wrote, "I finally labeled our photo albums." Someone else said, "We started a neighborhood record night. Everyone brings one document and a story." Churches began to hold legacy afternoons. Schools invited grandparents to speak. A lawyer downstate offered free consultations for veterans. Stories travel from porch to porch and change how neighbors act. What began as a local tangle became a national conversation about care, clarity, and memory. Asterisk, asterisk, and in the comments, someone wrote, "I found a box of letters in my attic. That message made me reach for the phone. Months later, I stood in the library with a stack of folders labeled Keeping Home and Heart. My granddaughter helped me arrange chairs. We called it a workshop, but really, it was a circle of people telling stories about what they wanted to leave behind and how to do it kindly. We talked about documents, but also about trust, forgiveness, and porch lights. The house now hosts school field trips, sewing nights, and civic gatherings. Thomas's tools gleam behind glass in the Evelyn suite, the plaque-catching morning sun. Every week someone leaves a note on the mantel thanking us for keeping memory warm. I thought handing over keys meant an ending, but it turned out to be a new kind of beginning. Next spring, we'll plant a garden on the front lawn, each plant with a story. Thank you for sitting with me today. Tell me in the comments, what one document or memory will you safeguard this week? Subscribe if you'd like to hear the next story, The Quilt That Kept a Promise. Because every home deserves care, and every story deserves a voice. See you next video.